Me a countdown. Hey, we're live.
We're live.
Welcome.
Dum
Welcome to
ba-dum.
Scalawags.
Da-da-da-da-dum. Da-dum,
Okay.
dum, ba-dum.
For those of you
Da-da-da-ba-dum. There we go. That's the theme music.
logged in anonymously on Google, and so I'm unable to set up our regular intro. I have an overlay because I'm anti-cookie. I don't like cookies.
I'm actually quite in favour of cookies, but
Yeah.
not too many of them.
At least if they're chocolate chip, that's...
Speaking of anonymous Google,
Yeah, who is that guy over there on the left?
we have a new Daniel. We have a new Daniel with us as a new Scalawags member. Heather Miller
Yay!
will be joining us. We're gonna change the format around a little bit. We're gonna try to record more often. Welcome, Heather, to the Scalawags. And yeah, so she'll be. We will randomly be rotating based on when people are available. Daniel had an emergency with his cat. He had to make it smaller, so
it got too large, so he couldn't fit in the apartment anymore.
Is he going to hang out?
but yeah. Anyway, just wanted to mention that. But let's get to our special guest. Our special guest right now is Antonio Salazar Cardozo. Right?
Nailed it.
No, nailed it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You would have no idea that I had to practice that about 10 times before the show.
Divided by 10.
Yeah. So today I'm actually super excited because Antonio is a active Lyft committer, and we're gonna talk about the Lyft web framework and what's been going on in Lyft. Lyft basically, I would say, was one of the gateways into Scala. Besides Dick Wall talking on Java Posse about Scala all the time, Lyft was one of the first, major libraries that kind of grabbed people's attention.
It's
Yeah.
the most important thing that ever happened to Scala, actually.
The way I would paint it is at the time that Scala was really starting to get some traction, Ruby on Rails was the big thing, and so Lyft was something people grabbed onto and said, this is the Ruby on Rails for Scala. And I'm not sure that was a very accurate description, but it got people interested. It got people through the door. So
I mean, that's a good question. Is would you consider renaming Lyft to Scala on skates?
Or scales, as the case may be.
Oh yeah,
Scala on scales. That makes it sound like Scala's got a bit big and is worried about its weight. The fact that it can't the scale.
You're using the scale to just flip it off the edge. No, so actually that's interesting that you mentioned that comparison. I came to Lyft from Rails, and it is not even close to the same thing.
No.
It's like, welcome. Now please forget everything that you've learned in all the other frameworks you've used before, because we do things a slightly different way around here. That's kind of the attitude, and since it was pitched as, Scala, but like the Rails for Scala, that's a very confusing angle to come at it from, and then eventually you figure out, oh no, this is a different thing. The only similarity is it serves web pages eventually.
Yeah. So.
You could, if you, like in a sentence, label what you think that Lyft is all about.
Yeah.
Its mission statement in life.
A single sentence?
Okay, a paragraph.
Do I get like three short sentences?
You can have 500 words, and one of us will keep track.
Okay.
I'll do my pencil.
No, so I'll throw out kind of the biggest things that I think set it apart from all of the other frameworks that I've used, extensively, essentially. Number one is that it's secure by default. Number two is that it makes real-time stuff just freakishly easy and done in a very Scala paradigm from Scala, like in terms of Scala. And number three is that it's very pragmatic about using Scala's type system. So, I mean, if we start at the top, secure by default means as much as possible, we try to make it so that if you build an application the Lift way, the way that it's presented in tutorials and the way that we advise that you do things on the mailing list, and the way that the framework guides you to do it, then you will end up with an application that's more secure than the equivalent application built in just about any other framework. You'll be resistant to cross-site scripting. You'll be generally resistant to replay attacks. That kind of thing is kind of out of the box with Lift. Now, I'm not going to say that it's more secure than anything out there, or that it's 100% secure, because we know that bulletproof is not something that occurs in the real world. But that said, there's significant thought that's gone into how it's built from a security perspective and from the perspective of making it resistant to some of these attacks. And there's thought continuing to go into how we can leverage the new features that browsers, etc., are bringing in for security purposes, how we can make that also available either out of the box or mind-blowingly easy, so it's really close to you. The second thing, which is real-time, Lift represents real-time interactions as actors. So it fits in really well with a lot of the other concurrency paradigms that get used throughout Scala. And, it takes a second to get into the actor framework of thinking, but once you're there, the difference between that and communicating with the browser using the actor is actually essentially non-existent, at least from my perspective. And then the third one is being pragmatic about types, which is, again, about providing a little more of that security, making it so when you access something like a page that requires a certain object of a certain type, we resolve it to that object, or we encourage you to resolve it to that object, look it up in the database, whatever, very early on in the process. And then everything else that you do for the duration of that request gets access to that first class object. You're not dealing with strings and IDs all over the place. You're dealing with real data.
So there's a lot to, there's many questions we could start digging into. So I think I'm curious about the way that you try to force getting access to the object early and stuff. So how is that done? What's the mechanism through which that's achieved?
Right. So the mechanism for exposing a page, by default, if you fire up a Lift application that's got basically nothing configured, you can start dropping templates, HTML templates, in its templates directory, and the application will not serve anything. So you have to explicitly kind of open a window into your templates through what is called the sitemap, which is more or less what it sounds like. It is a sitemap. But what the sitemap does is it lets you set up access to a page and say, this page will use this template, and it's going to exist at this path. And this is how we take the parameter that you hand this page, be it an ID or a set of query string parameters or whatever, and turn it into the object that the page actually represents. So, for example, if we're talking about a RESTful path to a business, okay, so like a company on your page. You have a site that's a list of companies and you want to go to a specific company's page. You would set it up and say, at /company/ID, we're going to have a page. The template for it is going to be company.html. And we turn that ID into a company by going to our database and saying company.find ID. And then we can turn the company back into an ID by saying, give me the company, ask for its ID. And those are part of the exposure process. Those are part of the process of setting up a page to be accessible in Lift, is getting that reification and the serialization back into a string.
So basically, right in the sitemap, you need to grab all the data and then feed it onto the view that gets rendered.
Right. In a sense. And the reason that I say in a sense is because another thing that Lift does a little differently is that the view per se, so you render a template, and the template is pure HTML. And what will happen is there will be places where you can attach data attributes. There's also a way to do it with specially marked classes, but I generally advise data attributes. So you can annotate data-lift equals, and then reference to a class or a method in a class. And those classes are called snippets. And those snippets, there can be multiple snippets on a page, and they're charged with essentially taking template data that's actually template data. It's representative data. If you were to render the HTML, hopefully you would get a functional, visible demo page, essentially. And then they take that template data and transform it based on whatever the current object is to display the real data that is relevant to the current page.
Yeah, I remember that about Lift. It's like a series of functional transformations that end up in a web page at the end of it. And once I figured that out, and I was like, oh yeah, this really isn't like Rails. Stuff fell into place a lot better. So.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened late in the 2.x release cycle, quote unquote, the way that these transformations used to be made is you'd embed XML, kind of namespaced XML elements into your HTML templates, and it was a little bit nasty. Like, it was still better in the sense that I think it did a much better job of separating the business logic from the view, which is kind of that holy grail of web development. It did a lot better job of that than any other framework I'd seen before, but you were still writing like nasty XML-y looking stuff that had nothing to do with the eventual HTML output that you wanted. So late in the Lift 2.x cycle, David Pollock, the kind of creator and for a long time BDFL of the framework, added this thing called CSS selector transforms. And what that does is it has a very CSS-y syntax for transforming things. So you basically select a given node based on regular CSS selectors or a subset thereof, and then say, okay, now I want to turn this element's contents into the company name for this particular company. And it's almost a DSL for doing these transformations, so that you end up writing pure HTML. Your templates are now pure HTML. There's no XML gunk anywhere. It's all HTML with that data attribute annotation that I was talking about a second ago. And as soon as we read in that template, it's no longer a string. So this is another thing, again, from the security perspective. As soon as you read in the template, what you get is actually a node seek. So a high-level XML, Scala XML data type that can be traversed as XML. That you need to jump through hoops essentially to stick stuff that's unescaped into it. So by default, everything is escaped. You know, if you stick content into a node, it's going to be escaped. It's not. People aren't going to be able to just drop random XML into your database and get it rendered out the other end. So all of that stuff is kind of handled not by Lift really, but by the Scala XML library.
Cool.
So, related to the Scala XML library, how happy are you with it?
You know, I actually rarely have to interact with it because of the CSS selector transforms. 99% of the time, I'm just transforming HTML that's been read in, and I'm not writing very much XML at all. In fact, I consider writing XML into your Scala in Lift to be a code smell, because ideally you're latching onto a template element that's already in the markup and just modifying. You're modifying its contents, you're adding or removing attributes, you're adding or removing CSS classes, and all of those things have first-class support in the selector transforms, so you very rarely find yourself having to interact directly with node seeks and elms and what have you. That said,
it's like a huge improvement over .7.
Yes. So that said, there were a lot of issues in Scala 2.7 with the library that kind of got ironed out in 2.8 in a lot of ways. There are still a couple of weird, like the multifarious existence of nodeseek, seek node, and node is like
the crazy triangle with f bounds. Yes.
the Doom triangle, I call it.
It's really a circle. But yeah.
But anyway, so that occasionally rears its head, and you're like, wait, what just happened? Because the error messages you get out of it are mind-blowing. You're just sitting there going, I don't really know what that means.
Just throw XML : group everywhere, and you're set.
And your problems are solved, exactly.
That's all you need.
Again, for the most part, you don't have to worry about that because the selector transforms have a bunch of implicits that take care of a lot of that pain for you. So
then when you do get the error message, it's even worse.
It is even worse, yes.
The beauty of implicits is you can defer the pain.
Yes. So I think there are actually, it's been a while since I've looked at the implicits, but I think there are occasionally implicits defined both for seek node and for node seek. Because otherwise, boom.
Yeah.
Basically the reason why.
I talking about XML and Scala, I know it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm actually curious. These problems with XML and Scala and the sort of notoriously not so great quality of Scala's built-in XML support, at one time this was pretty high on everyone's list of things that was criticized about Scala. That it was like, oh, you know, if I could go back and if I could send a message back in time to 2008 and be like, in 2014, none of this will have changed. But the weird thing is that it seems not to matter all that much anymore, right? So, and it's not that no one is using the XML. It just it turns out that I mean, what it sounds to me like it's not great, but it's fine. You can live with it.
Well, I think it's more that we've worked around all of the bugs, or we just don't exercise the parts that are buggy. Like it's a scar. But like you get scarred using this library, and so you just never use it in that way again, and it doesn't get fixed, right? Which is different than like it's no longer a problem because you don't use it in that fashion, but you actually haven't fixed the underlying issue. I do know that they were afraid to touch Scala XML for fear of breaking lift. There was like one bug that someone had tried to fix twice that had broken lift in the 2.7 and 2.8 series because lift was working around the existing bug, and if you fixed it, then it broke the workaround, and then lift is broken, right? So the thing remained in place, but I think it's more like you know, once you don't fix or if it ain't broke, don't fix it or whatever, you know. To some extent, we have that.
If it is broke, but you're used to it, don't fix it.
It's kind of like you don't see a lot of code using source. You see a lot of new people come to Scala and use source. You see them quickly not use source or whatever because it doesn't close, right? It doesn't. There's no. I think it's the same kind of thing with XML. Like you write a library like this CSS selector that does the right thing and works around all the bugs, and then you don't expose people to the underlying problems.
However, it was a bit of a gateway drug to Scala, wasn't it? I mean, I wasn't here at the time that, you know, everyone was picking up Scala, like, you know, in mass because of Lyft. I joined around 2010 or something like this, but all I remember is that, like, when I started, there was this kind of, like, downhill sort of, like, you know, people still like, yeah, Scala has built-in XML, you know, okay, cool, it's awesome. Yeah, sometimes, but all right, yeah, it's the cool language. It's got built-in XML, guys. Like people were still excited about it then. I mean, so it wasn't. I mean, it was also kind of like, I don't know, a gateway drug that people like kind of like kicked or something and worked around or whatever. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, wasn't XML also kind of like a killer feature that brought people to Scala? Like,
I think the built-in XML is actually like the fact that it's built in the language. I think is super elegant. The fact that you can make literals and stuff. I mean, that's. The fact that it auto-escapes into XML is just beautiful, and Lyft really took advantage of that in the 0.7, and I think it still does. But the actual like API for traversing the DOM and doing pattern match stuff, that's the areas where things start to get funky. Like the way it handled namespacing, it doesn't actually handle certain classes of namespaces and stuff. Those are the kind of issues that people have with the XML library. Or the fact that you have, I think it's node extends node seek, which extends sequence of node.
That's the one.
And yeah, you can't get better than that, really.
Yeah, it's like Foghorn Leghorn saying, "I'm not going to go over there in case I find, I open up and find myself."
Yeah, well,
else in that cartoon.
The composite pattern. I mean, it's right in the Gang of Four. We just took it to the next level.
So I hear the reason that Daniel isn't here tonight is that he's too busy working on fixing that.
Oh yeah, Daniel made a competitive anti-XML library that was supposed to be a replacement for Scala.xml. Yeah.
And if you were here, we could mercilessly badger him about it.
It was supposed to be done 2 years ago.
Poor Daniel.
Is that the story of anything that involves XML handling? Like it was supposed to be done X years ago, and then it just never happens.
Yeah.
So it's worth mentioning that Lyft had the advantage, and still has the advantage, that even though we use all the XML stuff, we're not really using it for XML. We're using it for HTML, and HTML, it turns out, is a little bit easier to deal with. Like namespaces doesn't really happen. Like especially now that HTML5 is the big thing, and we've moved away from XHTML. Namespaces are not a thing. We don't have to worry about them at all. Most of the more complicated aspects of XML we don't have to deal with. The only thing you get in trouble with is Lyft actually. So Lyft uses an HTML parser, and uses that to go from string to nodeseek. And that HTML parser uses HTML rules, which do not look at all like XML rules. So it'll actually respect things like structure. So if an element is not supposed to be in another element, it'll get pushed out, which can be confusing if you are not expecting it, and are not expecting to have an actual HTML parser going through your maybe not formed HTML.
That's actually really cool. I didn't know that they'd thrown in a real HTML parser.
Yeah, so right around when this form work went in, we also pulled in an HTML5 parser that kind of follows the W3C spec, what is now the W3C spec, and all of their failure, very well-defined failure modes for situations where elements are supposed to be, etc., etc. So it does all of that the way that it's supposed to. So the nice thing is it means that if you catch a weird issue in your template at render time, that means you run into it in a conforming browser, only you caught it a little bit earlier because things weren't behaving the way you expected. So I consider it an upside, but it also means some mailing list posts where people are like, I tried to put this thing in my page header and it's not more. It gets pushed into the body for some reason. It's like, oh, here's why. I've got an answer for you.
That's pretty cool, actually. Yeah, catch it early.
That's the goal. Catch it early. Both for security issues and for a lot of it.
I'm gonna start using my my old Lyft knowledge again. .7. Okay. .7. I worked on this website called the Scala Liftoff conference site. Do you remember that?
I remember.
Anyway.
Me too.
Yeah.
Just to clarify really quick, when you say .7, you're referring to the Scala 2.7 release, or are you referring to
Lyft 0.7?
0.7.
0.7. Yeah, that's
yeah. Ancient history, man.
Well, no, it's just I was playing in the Rails world at the time. I was like, oh man, render.
I had Rails on one side, I had Lyft on the other, but Scala was on one side, and Hipster was on the other. So I had to. I couldn't. I had to go functional. But anyway, back then it was super continuation passing, like the way that forms were done. You'd have like a form on a website, and it'd be attached to an object, and you have these functions that you'd like say when they click the submit button, run this function, and it would capture all of the state from the page and keep all these things in the server, in memory. And then when the submit comes back, it would hit this function. And there's a lot of interesting aspects to that design, but that was the real mind bender. When you went, like, rendering, that's the first hit, is, okay, we're going to start with the view template, and there's going to be these things that we then go include that, mean we render this bit or we render that bit, right? The view first aspect. But then the second mind bender was with forms and this continuation style of, I'm going to render a page, and then all of that state's just going to be sitting somewhere in server memory for the next request to hit, and then I'm going to, like, continue off of that. Is Lift 2.0 still like that? Like, how are forms handled, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually exactly the same way. I think you attach functions to fields. So when the value of a field is seen in a form submission, its associated function runs, and then you attach ultimately a function to the submit button, which kind of has a higher or a lower priority rather, so that it gets run last. And then that can do whatever needs to be done with whatever the results of all of the fields were. So a lot of times the fields have a function associated with them that just assigns their value into a var, and then the submit handler is the one that creates an object, or say updates an object and saves it or whatever. And yeah, that is a little weird. So it's also part of the strength. So one of the things that I talked about earlier was that we get this resistance to replay attacks. And the way that happens is that when you bind a function, what actually gets sent down to the server, or to the client, sorry, the name is associated with this GUID, this randomly generated GUID. And that GUID, when it gets seen again on the server, fires off the associated function. But that GUID is also unique to the page rendering. So if you reload the page, then you'll get different GUIDs for everything, and they'll be associated with the functions that got bound for that page render. And what that means is that since those GUIDs last usually, if I remember correctly, about 2 minutes after the last time that the page is being displayed in a browser that's connected to the internet, you have about that window during which you can reuse those field names to fake another submission as an attacker. And then once that's done, it's game over. Like you can resubmit those GUIDs, and they won't do anything, most likely. Or in the extremely unlikely case that you get a collision with an existing one, they'll probably do something completely unrelated.
Cool.
What's the collision rate for the GUID? Is it once every 2 billion?
Yeah, it's a pretty small.
Yeah.
It's a pretty small chance.
Somebody was concerned about that on the mailing list once, and I think someone did the math, and it was, it might happen once before the Earth ceases to exist. It's not
with probabilities, which could be wrong.
Yes, I was going to say, and that will happen to me.
Exactly. Inevitably, it's going to
yeah.
But the thing is, so the key is that as unlikely as it is for the GUID itself to repeat, it's even less likely that it's going to repeat for something be able to handle the same thing. And a form is made up of multiple functions. So you have to have all of them repeat and correspond to the same snippet. And so that's just basically not going to happen.
Yeah.
So related then, I remember back in the day, the early Scala liftoff conferences, there were talks about how to scale lift. And at that point, you needed to use sticky session load balancers. Is that?
Do that.
Okay.
So the key is, when I came to Lift, actually, I'd heard of stateful servers only once or twice before, mostly in the context of Seaside, which is a Smalltalk framework. That had kind of pioneered it, and I've always liked Smalltalk, but never actually had a Smalltalk VM to to play with locally. So I never got a chance to experiment with Seaside. So Lyft was my first exposure. But because the Lyft server is stateful, what that means is a lot of the session-specific state that you pull in, that in Rails, for example, you maybe send down the user ID in a cookie, right? And then when you get it back at the beginning of the request, you go into the database and you read the user, and then you have that available for the duration of the request. In Lyft, you'd stick that in a session var, and a session var is actually, you'd load up the user, it's a first-class object, and it sticks around for the duration of the session without any additional lookups. It's just in memory. So everything about Lyft, unless you explicitly choose to turn off statefulness, is stateful on the server side. And what that means is we have to be able to send you to the same server every time a request from you hits us. So in practice, that means you need sticky sessions. And also in practice, that doesn't seem to be a huge barrier. There are sites that have scaled significantly well. And
what do you use as a load balancer? I'm just curious. Like, I know HA proxy is the latest hotness that everyone's talking about. Does that have sticky session support? Is it pretty nice?
Yes, HA proxy does have sticky session support. There are a couple of different modes that it can work in. I think the one that I used it in was you can just have it assign a cookie for you. So you can basically, when you list out the servers that it's going to connect to, you give them a name, and then you ask it to stick a cookie in there that identifies the server that it's going to go to. So the first request that it sees without the cookie, as it kind of sends back the HTTP response from the Lyft server, it also attaches its own cookie to know which session it's going to be associated with, and then, or sorry, which server it's going to be associated with, and then from then on out, that cookie tells it, send it over here, send it over here. That becomes a little harder when you have to do SSL termination behind HA proxy. So then it gets a little more complicated. I've never had to deal with that issue. I think usually the solution is, now that HA proxy can do it, you terminate SSL at HA proxy and have it do all that work, and that way it can be in charge of, it can see the actual HTTP stream. It's not just seeing bytes flying by. At Alemica, where I work, we're using an elastic load balancer, an Amazon ELB, and that also supports sticky sessions out of the box.
Cool.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm gonna go for a question here that makes it sound like I know more about the web programming side than I really do. But so if I get it wrong and it makes no sense, that's the reason I'm not really a web guy. But I know that one of the features that was played up a lot in Lyft during the early days was the fact that it used Comet through actors to do a very nice kind of interactive feel, you know, with kind of server push and everything like that. I also vaguely know that there's kind of been this revolution in web servers that WebSockets are now taking over from Comet. So does Lyft support WebSockets in the same way as it did the Comet stuff?
So the answer is no. We don't actually support WebSockets as a transport medium. Adding WebSocket support would not be particularly difficult, but we're not actually convinced it's worth our time to do it right now. Comet actually works really well. The fact that HTTP Keep Alive exists means that typically you're not paying TCP socket creation overhead for Comet most of the time. So the browser will maintain the TCP connection for the long polls that you're doing. So you're not having to do that setup teardown all the time. Which means the only real upside of WebSocket is that you don't have the overhead of an HTTP request every time. And in practice, that hasn't really proven to be a big issue in our collective experience. So nobody's really, the questions that we get about WebSockets are always new people going, WebSockets are apparently awesome, why don't you support it?
That's pretty much what I've heard, yeah.
People saying, we have this issue and WebSockets would solve it.
This is about WebSockets to remember, because we debated this a lot in Activator. the WebSockets might be blocked by a firewall because it's not strictly HTTP, right? So you need to think about that. You know, you might actually run into inverse security problems where users can't actually hit your socket. My question is, are you guys thinking about using sorry, someone just pinged cat alert. I think your Daniel's cat must have come down to you.
Just looking at the window at a bush. I don't know why it's interesting, but it is apparently.
Have you guys looked at server-side events as an option?
I've actually got it written down as something to look at for the Lift 3 cycle when I get a chance, which might be never at this rate, but I'm definitely interested.
For those listeners, I'm not admitting to not knowing what these are myself, but for those listeners who might know what a server-side event is, could you enlighten them, please?
So server-side. Okay, so here's what I'll say the fundamental differences between these things. Okay, Comet is this notion that you open an HTTP request and don't do anything, and then data shows up, and then once it shows up, you reopen the connection. Or if you have the keep alive, the connection's still there, you just issue a request again, right? And nothing comes back until there's data to send. WebSockets are a two-way street. You can send data down and get data down. It's kind of like just a socket over HTTP, sort of, right? It's literally meant to be like a socket. You just send crap. So
got it.
That's beautiful if you're doing some low-level protocol. Yay. Server-side events are more like long polling, but the connection never closes. The way it works is you can just do this now. You open up a connection via HTTP, and you get like a blank line and then data. It actually says data : and then the contents. And once you see a blank line, you're like, okay, that event's done. I'm going to parse the event and handle it.
So it's just like SBT?
It's kind of like SBT, yeah. If you see data : you know it's part of the event stream. And then once there's a blank line, you say, okay, that event's done. And then when you see data : again, that's the next event. You can handle it and parse it. So you can send JSON down these things, but the stream never closes. It's just always open. Now, there's a server-side event library that's implemented via long polling for browsers that don't directly support server-side events. But if you have a browser that supports them, the connection just always stays open, and there's no HTTP request overhead. You just get the data coming in. And you know, it's a quick little JavaScript make a socket and get your data coming down thing. So I actually implemented them as a prototype for Activator, but we wanted the two-way communication. Like it's basically actors in JavaScript talking to actors in the server and SBT. So we just said, screw it, we're doing a WebSocket. And since we're running locally on a machine, the firewall shouldn't be an issue. Little did we know that there are some companies that block internal WebSockets.
Oh my god.
But anyway, that's a different story. It's a different story.
Why be surprised at this point?
Yeah. So you should definitely. Server-side events are really interesting if you're doing long poll. But anyway, I hope that was a clarification of the three different.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's actually increased my knowledge of the space about threefold just from this interview. So. That's pretty good.
My knowledge of it is that's 2 years stale right now, I think. So.
I think it's actually it's 100% up to date at this point. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed is I think WebSockets are now actually not horribly insecure the way they were originally.
Oh, that's good.
Oh yeah, that was an issue. Yeah, I remember. We were like really terrified to use them. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was definitely a bit of an adjustment period there as well. I think the other thing worth mentioning is, you know, WebSockets are bidirectional, as you mentioned. Typically, the way that you get around that if you're doing long polling or server-side events is, you know, you do an AJAX request for the stuff that sends data to the server. It's not always easy to reconcile that with, you know, like get that into a place where it can then be handled and then produce the event or the long poll result that you need. So the way that this works in Lift is much like you can bind a function to a field, you can actually, a function on a form field is really just a parameter with a particular name, right? If we see a particular name in a request from the client, then we know that we need to fire the associated function in the server if it exists. So what that means is that you can not only bind the form fields, but you can actually pretty much bind anything you want. You can just say, I want this function on the server to be invocable on the client. Please give me its ID, and I will, be able to do an AJAX request that fires it off, right?
Yeah.
I love the fact that your cat is taking over from Daniel's cat as the foreground monster.
Is it the same cat? The same cat, Daniel's not here. Well, so,
Daniel's cat is still on the podcast.
The puppet cat is, has to be here somehow, patrolling some menu. So this one.
Same color as my shirt, which is nice. You just blend.
The cat is our overlord.
Does the cat also contribute to Lift?
The cat has been known to attempt to contribute to Lift. I usually manage to excise the contributions before they break the compilation cycle. Oddly, ZXY:/ is not valid Scala. Unless you're using Scala C, and then all bets are off.
It's true, although you might not remember there used to be a Scala LOL library.
Oh,
yes.
So we also have a newer tradition that your mom has to appear on the episode if she's available.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, rating something of some kind. I mean, if it's edible, it's better.
Yeah. All right, so I think we should get back to some of the questions. Lift, I'm curious about your actual architecture now. So one thing that I think was interesting with like Play and Spray is they ditched the container, the J2EE container,
right.
And said, these things aren't keeping. We're gonna go raw. The only thing we care about is the JVM, and Lift all ran inside of whatever container you wanted. In fact, my first Lift app for work was inside of JBoss.
Oh dear God.
Yes. Yes.
I'm so sorry.
It was as good as you could have hoped.
I'm not sure if you were warned that you were going to be interviewed by a panel of senior citizens.
I think we decided beforehand that this wizened fellow was the official term.
It's true. It's true. I mean, to be fair, it was right before JBoss got renamed to Spitfire or Prodigy or whatever the heck they tried to like make them sound like a techno band, whatever the new name is. I forget what it's called now. Have you guys know what I'm talking about?
I have no clue.
No, JB named, they rebranded. You guys, seriously, nobody. What? What's it called now? It's got a
J-Boss renamed to J-Bro.
J-Bro.
No, it's more like a '90s techno band is what they're trying to get started with. But yeah,
as long as it makes you want to dance, that's all that really matters.
Maybe I'm wrong here, but I think they renamed the actual like app platform to something weird. I thought, or maybe it was the Sun one. One of these guys renamed themselves to like Firestorm or something like that, or Spitfire. I forget. Anyway, not that it matters. The more important thing is, instead of trying to rebrand J2EE to make it sound cool, because I'm old, what's Lift architecture right now in terms of like hosting? Like, are you guys running on top of Netty? Is it like a variable thing?
Right. So it's still usually run inside a container. Typically, Jetty is what most of the people I know use. I believe there are facilities for it to be run on top of Netty, though I haven't tried them myself. But Jetty's pretty lightweight. you can embed it in your jar at this, or in your war or whatever at this point, so that it's just an application that you fire up as if it were a standalone thing. So I think it's kind of done the trick for us, and we haven't gotten too many complaints, / any really. Some people wanted to use Netty, I think especially StackMob before they were acquired, did a lot of work to get Lift running behind Netty. Because that made a lot of sense in their environment. But beyond them, I think only a couple of other people have asked about Netty support specifically, and nobody else has really asked about decoupling from the container so much. I think at this point it's, again, one of those works, and nobody necessarily, like, it's not the most interesting part to try and go change, so nobody has really necessarily gone and done it. There are more interesting avenues that I think most of us want to explore with Lift, especially in terms of taking the ideas that are already there and taking them further. So I think there's just not that much interest at the moment in moving away from the container architecture.
Yeah. I think in terms of Scala web framework, I don't know of any besides Play and Spray. So I don't know of any that actually still live inside of a container. Like, if you wanted to run inside of a war, like, Lift is the thing.
The only choice.
The only choice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, again, it's one of those things where I think part of the reason why Lift probably managed to get off the ground fairly quickly was because it used a lot of stuff that was already there. The container for a lot of the HTTP handling, the Scala XML library for a lot of the XML heavy lifting. A lot of that stuff was already there, and it was leveraged so that the other more interesting problems could be solved on top of them, on top of those libraries, and I think that has proven to be a pretty good pattern that we've used and continue to use, sort of.
Is Lift planning to use Scala Pickling?
I have been keeping an eye on Scala Pickling. I don't know about Lift in general, though that would be interesting. I think several of the committers would probably want to play with it first and use it for projects before we pushed it into the framework. One of the other things worth mentioning is Lift is maybe a little more conservative than a lot of frameworks out there in terms of we really want to maintain stability and API compatibility through releases and what have you. 3.0, which is a release that's kind of been brewing for well over a year at this point, is our big opportunity to break APIs and stuff, and so we're being careful with it. But generally speaking, one of the things with Lift is, milestone builds are typically stable. There are people who run them in production. Release candidates are very much if everything explodes, then we need to fix it, but otherwise, for the most part, we just release and then wait for the next milestone release because we know the next milestone release will also be stable. So there's a very strong emphasis on stability, and that is also part of the reason why we kind of wait out technology sometimes, things like WebSockets, what have you, kind of wait it out and make sure that all the kinks are ironed out before we dive in. So, that's the rationalization anyway. The other part of the reason is there's only so much time in the day, and I think Lift might be, I'm not going to put my hand in the fire, as they say in Greece, for this, but I think Lift might be one of the few frameworks, possibly the only one, at least for Scala, that has no full-time people whose job it is to work on Lift. So every single committer on Lift is doing this pretty much in their spare time. Technically, some of us have, technically the company where I work is willing to put up with me working on Lift 10 to 20% of the time. In reality, if I'm going to get done what needs to get done for work, then I'm probably not working that much on Lift, right? I'm doing mailing list support, and that's it. All of the actual coding for Lift happens in my own time. And I think it's true of most of the committers.
So how many people are you right now, actively committing? I mean, you're releasing like what, once a year or something, but like how many people are like contribute as committers to this kind of thing, and how many people sort of contribute as contributors? Like, what's your community like?
So there's no such thing as a contributor.
Right.
One of the other things is David Pollock, who created the framework, kind of has a background in law. He graduated with a law degree and what have you, and so he was very adamant about making sure that the framework itself was legally bulletproof for companies that wanted to acquire it. And what that means is that we actually, for better or worse, only accept pull requests from people who haven't officially been invited to be committers in cases where it's for documentation or for extremely minor code changes. So the end result is that the only code contributions have come from people who are Lift committers, and to become a Lift committer, you typically have to be invited. To be invited, you typically have to contribute to the community via the mailing list and support for a while.
And there's a ritual that involves a squirrel and a.
Don't talk about that usually, but I can neither confirm nor deny, but squirrels and cats may be involved. And also a Davy Crockett hat.
So the cat is actually the Lift cat. It's what you're given when you become a member. That's how Daniel got his. Oh, I get it now.
The Lift cat actually is the watchdog. It keeps an eye on you, make sure you're doing things correctly.
It's the legal watchdog. It reports to the boss if you've done something wrong.
I mean, just being a cat owner, that's the way the cat works anyway.
It is a super interesting model, though.
All cats report to David Pollock.
To throw it out there though, like I don't know of many other open source projects that operate like in that same vein. You know, like it's just a really interesting model to analyze. Like, so in terms of like the committer community then in the group, like how does that affect who comes in? Like what kind of interaction have you had with the Lift committers versus other open source like groups?
I think in general, the result is just that it's a much smaller community of contribution, essentially. There's very little that happens in private. There is a committers mailing list or whatever, but it's one message a month. Occasionally, somebody going, hey, does anyone want to actually spin up an RC release for the next version of Lift or whatever? But the vast majority of the conversation still happens on public mailing lists. Often, if something gets started on the committer's mailing list and there's no reason for it to be private, like it's not noise, then we push it to the public mailing list because we do want to continue to do the development in the open. It's not at all about segregating the development. It really is about making sure the intellectual property can be traced and that you can be sure as a company when you decide to adopt Lift that you are in good hands, essentially. It's true that there have been a lot of open source projects that at this point have, I won't say proven, but have done well despite not having these protections in place. But there also haven't been many opportunities to test the legal framework that they're built on. And I think ultimately, because the community is already structured this way, we've kind of gone, all right, well, it works, and it does provide us some potential advantages in the future. So unless we see that it's killing us, then let's keep doing it this way. So but getting back to the question of how many there are, I don't keep the official catalog on me. The scroll with the
cat.
Unfortunately, the cat. One of the problems is the cat knows all the committers, but he can't speak, so he can't tell them to. It's like he's just sitting there gloating and meowing.
But somehow David Pollock can understand him.
Yeah. I occasionally have a Google Hangout with David just so that he can translate.
There's like this cat binary protocol that takes place at that point.
No,
if anyone could understand cat binary, it would be.
Has the cat signed the contributor agreement?
No, which is why it's really important that I get rid of his pawing. But no, there's I think there's probably five or six people who are active at the moment. The actual list of official committers is much longer than that. I think it's 2025, but it's also the people who have been accumulated over all of the years of Lyft. So the vast majority of them are alumni in one way or another. And the 4 or 5 who contribute kind of more regularly, of those, I think there are 3 who really get in there fairly consistently. One of them is me, one of them is Diego Medina, and one of them is Matt Farmer, who is someone I've worked with for some time as well.
Cool.
So who is it who's offering the commercial support for Lyft through liftweb.com?
I think that's David. I can't promise that 100%, but I think it's David.
Okay. Okay.
And there are, I think, a couple of other people. I don't know if there are any other consultancies that are, or any really consultancies that are built around just Lyft work. But there are a number of consultants who do Lyft work who hang out on the mailing list and ask and help and what have you.
Okay, so if somebody wants to learn, and this I think is a little bit of a loaded question, because I got into Lyft when I started learning Scala a long time ago, and I remember the learning curve was pretty steep to begin with. I imagine that has changed an awful lot now. So if somebody's new to Lyft, what is the best vector in?
So I was actually listening. I did a cram session before we started here, and I just watched like bits and pieces of 3 of your previous Scalawags podcasts, because I've never really heard it before. I was just like, crap, I need to figure out what's going on. And I saw you talk to Heather, who apparently has been in charge of a lot of the documentation work for Scala. There hasn't been a person like that largely for the Lyft community, and I'm trying to be that person as much as I can and have been for the past few months. But right now, the learning curve is still kind of steep. So there are 3 or 4 books out there, and one of them is Simply Lyft, which was written by David, but most of them are in one way or another slightly outdated compared to the current best practices way of writing a Lyft app, because Lyft moved very quickly for about 3 years while those were being written, so they became outdated very quickly. Simply Lyft is probably the closest because it's got all the CSS selector transform information. It's got the latest on Comet actors. There's no place that really, like the information about the new stuff that's come with Lyft 3 is scattered across blog posts and such. So I'm currently in the process of trying to write a new tutorial that kind of introduces it from the ground up and covers a lot of the various features that it has. I'm also currently in the process of trying to write documentation for various individual kind of components, verticals, if you will, within the framework that explain in a little more depth what those aspects do. Time permitting, I'd really like to get a lot of that out with Lyft 3. I want Lyft 3 to come with up-to-date documentation and another one of the things that I've been experimenting with while writing this documentation is so I wrote documentation for the CSS selector transforms, and one of the things in that documentation is examples. So it's like, this is input HTML, here transform, here's what the output HTML will look like, and one of the things I tried to do with that is take this documentation and render it executable. So using actually Lyft's own CSS selector transform stuff, I basically read in the documentation is written in ASCII doc. It's compiled to HTML. Then I use Lyft to read in HTML, pull out the examples, and then turn them into a Scala test that can be executed to make sure that the documentation itself is actually up to date with respect to what's happening in the framework. So part of it.
The holy grail. That's the holy grail of docs.
It is.
Also, also, you need an extra transformation that converts them into lol code first.
This is a middle step.
And then to doggy script.
You and your hobbies.
Anyway.
I don't know if I have time to write all of that. That's the only problem.
It's just transformation. It's just transformation.
So.
Transforming's easy, right?
That's true. It is. And that's what midnight to 4 a.m. is for anyway.
Yeah.
So a couple times you've mentioned Lift 3.0. What are those big breaking changes that you guys will finally get to make?
So one of the things is the form handling that we were talking about earlier has kind of accumulated and built up over the course of 6 or 7 releases of Lift. And so we've ended up in this situation where there are a lot of ways to bind a given type of field that differ very subtly one from the other. And none of that stuff is actually really written to leverage the way that CSS selector transforms work. So one of the things that we're trying to do is rework some of that form binding code to make it in charge solely really of binding the server-side function and letting the user do in the HTML whatever they want to do in the HTML. You know, if they want to tweak the text field to have a certain max length or whatever, they can do that using a CSS selector transform to apply the appropriate attribute, rather than having this method called text that takes in the callback function and also these 7 other parameters that vary in various different invocations and do different things depending on how you're calling it and what have you. So it's a lot of simplification around that aspect of it. Another part is Comet actors are actually a really nice way of interacting with the server, but taking that one step further. So Lift 3 already currently has support for sending down a JavaScript object whose member properties are callback functions. So you call the function and they actually fire a function on the server. And then they return a promise on the client that you can wait on or subscribe to or whatever, however you want to interact with it to get the eventual response from the server when the server finishes computing what it's going to do. So in a lot of ways similar to what some frameworks like Meteor are doing out there with JavaScript, only on the server you have a language that is well typed to avoid saying doesn't suck.
Yeah.
Which I didn't avoid saying.
Strongly typed.
Yes.
I don't know. It's not. This ain't a weak language.
Yeah, exactly. This is all strength.
But
the Alexander the Great of languages.
Question around that: JavaScript and Lift in the early Lift days. Again, I feel any project that gets adopted heavily before it's fully matured in some of these areas, you end up with these like sticking points that are always in your mind of the things that people complain about. SBT is a great example. I've been on the end of that where you are with Lift, right? But what JavaScript and Lift used to be like this war, if you will, where people who wanted to write lots and lots of JavaScript and just wanted it in there were very frustrated early on and would make rants on the mailing list and then get booted, right? So
it never happens. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. No, I never said that. But anyway,
we'll edit that out of the podcast.
That way I won't get booted from the mailing list. The JavaScript and Lift, essentially, Lift actually writes JavaScript. Like the server renders JavaScript functions and things that it will render in. So how is it using Lift with like modern JavaScript things? I'm a fan of Knockout, even though it's not as popular as things like Angular or whatever. But what are you using heavy amounts of JavaScript with Lift, or is it just like jQuery kind of stuff? What would you say is canonical Lift JavaScript interaction?
I don't think there's a canonical Lift JavaScript interaction. In a lot of ways, I think maybe because the Lift community is still a little bit small, there is no canonical anything interaction. There's the right way to do things if you're doing them in Lift, and then there's what people have done as their applications evolve over time. So I've used, my approach is always to kind of start by using just lift. So write my HTML and then write my lift transformations and potentially use the Ajax functionality that's provided out of the box by lift. There's some really nice stuff that lets you handle things like re-rendering parts of the page on the client and do that entirely from Scala with Scala without really touching JavaScript. JavaScript gets generated in the background and does it great. But there ultimately always comes a point when you want to add kind of richer interactions, or you want to add certain behaviors on the client, where for me it doesn't make any sense to do that in Lift. Like that's not the server's job. So one of the things I really like about Lift is that it very clearly says this is what the server does. And then the HTML is very clearly this is what the markup does. The JavaScript is this is what the behavior does. And the CSS is this is how we style it all, right? So the web community, especially the early 2000s front-end community, and this is carried forward till today, has had a very strong approach of separation of concerns between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Lift is the best framework I found to kind of add a fourth column to that list that is still independent and still has that separation of concerns. So what that means is when I need additional behavior, I can just start using jQuery. And then maybe the client starts getting really rich and maybe a little more appy, essentially, a little more interactive on the client. And I need to switch out, I can make Lift all of a sudden start sending JSON and function bindings for us to call back to Lift. And on the client, I'll use Knockout. So literally, the application that we've built at Alenica has pages that are entirely done in Lift. And it has pages that are done in Lift with some jQuery kind of sugar sprinkled on top. And it has pages that are almost entirely driven in Knockout and bound to JavaScript exchanges.
You made the right call in terms of picking JavaScript framework. That was the right call. Just gonna throw that out there, but yeah.
I do love Knockout. I'm not gonna lie. Also looking at React. Angular is not my thing. Angular is the opposite of my thing. Joe Barnes, who originally connected me with you guys, is probably going to hate me for saying that out loud. He's actually he's been building honestly one of the coolest things I've seen with Lift so far, which is this bidirectional binding between Angular and Lift, where you can bind Angular models in such a way that they have properties that are synchronized with Lift models on the server. And synchronized in both directions, essentially. So if they get updated on the server, they get sent out on the client, and vice versa. And it's almost painless for the user. Like it's almost zero effort. Now, eventually, you'll run into issues, and you'll have to deal with that. But the level of integration that he's achieved, I think, is pretty phenomenal.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but. Circling back to the separation of concerns thing, it's because I really like to harp on this. There are kind of two approaches to them, and I think both of them were seen in the Lift community at some point. There's actually a whole chunk of Lift API that is for writing JavaScript in Scala, which is to say corresponding elements, almost like an AST. For JavaScript kind of content, so that you can write it fairly well typed in Scala, and then it gets rendered to a JavaScript string, and it goes to the client and gets executed. JavaScript, but so that you have a little bit more safety. I think ultimately
if it had waited for Scala.js or just macros, just imagine how terrifying that API could have been. Just imagine.
I might have had to jump off a building at that point. No, I'm just kidding. I actually think Scala.js is really cool, and I'm kind of keeping a corner of my eye on it because there could be some really cool integrations that could be done there as well. But in the meantime, the JavaScript stuff that's there is kind of for me at least, it's kind of if absolutely necessary, use this, but if at all avoidable, do this on the client, right? It's like seeing the Lift JavaScript kind of parallels in code is a code smell a lot of the time. And That is a personal opinion. There are some people who don't feel as strongly about that, but I can't do it. I like to write my JavaScript. Caveat emptor. So I speak 4 languages, which I all learned before I was 10. So
Wow.
in order to keep them straight, the way that my parents taught me, my mother's Greek, so she taught me Greek, and she would only respond in Greek. And my father is Colombian, so I speak Spanish with him, and he would only respond if I spoke to him in Spanish. Like if I tried to speak to either of them in a language that wasn't theirs, they would just basically say, I'm not going to answer you until you say this in the right language. So I have this kind of hardwired brain thing where I really like separation of concerns, I think, as a result.
Yeah. Well, so related. Okay, I feel like Angular, Knockout are starting to push towards these more rich client things where the state lives in the browser with the JavaScript. Lyft fundamentally is a stateful server, and the only thing I can think that really compares with Lyft that got popularity, besides Seaside is great, but it suffered the smallpox basically.
Yeah.
But Gwt actually is the closest comparison I can think of a stateful server. Where you embed all of your state knowledge in the server and it lives there. Whereas I feel like the push now is you kind of turn your web server into a database and call it REST, and then you put all of the behavior in the JavaScript, right? That's kind of like the new push, the new cool thing.
Yeah.
So Lyft is kind of fundamentally still saying no, like we want a stateful server. What's your opinion on like when you would pick one versus the other? I mean, you're using Knockout for an application. Where does that separation come in? How do you decide?
So there are a couple of things worth mentioning. Number one, I wouldn't say that Lyft is fundamentally opposed to that. The facilities in Lyft for stateless operation are actually really good. The API for creating REST endpoints is actually one of the nicest ones that I've used. It leverages Scala's pattern matching in rather beautiful ways, I think. So in that sense, Lyft supports that as well, and that's actually one of the things that I really like about it is that it goes back to what I was saying. You can kind of pick where along the continuum your particular application, or maybe even one particular part of your application, needs to live, and which one makes the most sense. For me, it's the difference between when am I building a web page versus when am I building a web app. I think a lot of people build web applications that should be pages. They should they really are just documents. Maybe they scroll infinitely because they have a lot of content, but at the end of the day, they're still just content on a page. And that's not necessarily an application per se. Whereas one of the things that we're building where I work is this interface for mapping between message standards, and that, because it's almost an IDE for a programming language that tries not to let you see the programming language in some ways. That is an application. It's almost like you're building a mini Eclipse in the browser, which sounds terrifying now that I say it aloud. I might just have to go and tell everyone, never mind, I said it aloud and this is a terrible idea. Let's stop. but I mean, that's really an application. And where the distinction lies between them, I think every person kind of has their tolerance for where the distinction lies. I think like most fads, kind of a dirty word, but like most fads, I think eventually we'll realize that building everything client-heavy is just as terrible an idea as building everything server-heavy was when we couldn't build things client-heavy, right? I really think there are cases where one works and cases where another one works, and you can use different frameworks for each, or you can use one framework for all of them, or whatever, but the important thing to me is to make sure that you're choosing the right paradigm for what it is that you're building. If what you're doing is client-heavy and you can do it in a way that's secure, then that's great. If what you're building is server heavy and you can build it in a way that's secure, that's great. I think that, to me, is one of the most important things, is can you build it in a way that it's secure and that you can resist some of these really nasty attacks that more and more are being seen in the wild.
See, I always thought the definition of if you're building a web page, you did it in PHP. And if you're building a web app, then you hire a developer.
I didn't realize that we were going to get into name calling here, but
no, I'm sorry. I'm being mean tonight, man. It must be the beer.
I've walked through the PHP world. For what it's worth, actually, most of the people that I code with in Lyft have walked through the PHP world. They've at least briefly visited the Rails world. So we've kind of seen some of the other frameworks, and this is what we settled on. Whether it's where we'll be 5 years from now, who knows? It's hard to tell in this industry.
You walk through the valley of the shadow of PHP.
It's interesting. PHP to me is super interesting because think about it this way: PHP, a lot of those frameworks are things where your average user is someone who doesn't care about programming, has a blog, and they just want to copy and paste crap off the internet and have it work.
Yep. And
that's all they want to do.
A tremendous use case. I actually think they nailed that use case.
Yeah.
And
it works.
As much as it is the thing in the web development world to harp on PHP and to hate on it, but I actually think that there is nothing out there that's better for that. PHP was one of the first languages that I learned as a result, and quite frankly, I don't know if I would be here if it didn't exist, right? I don't know if I'd be doing this because it was so easy to get started, and sometimes the only thing that matters is to get started. The only thing that matters is to get going, and then you eventually get to the point where you're good enough, you've been doing this for long enough, that you start paying attention to other people going, there are better ways to do this, and you start looking into those better ways, and then you grow past it. But if PHP only exists as a stepping stone, if that is its sole reason for existence, and I don't think it is, I think a lot of people would disagree that it is, but even if it is its sole reason for existence, even if it's the only thing it's good at, I think it's tremendously important to the industry anyway.
Yep.
Oh, cool. That actually might be a good curtain to pull at this point, I think.
Talking about PHP.
Oh dear.
Well, no, the inspirational message at the end of it I thought was very good there.
Yeah.
I feel inspired.
I really agree with you, actually. If that there are other ways of building web apps besides PHP, but they're for different audiences. So we think of it as there's a better way, but that better way involves becoming a different kind of developer with a different purpose. I mean, so if for this other audience, if PHP is all there is, that's our fault. It's our fault for not building a better alternative for that audience.
And part of the
focusing on the copy-paste use case is actually a great way to improve adoption of your whatever. That use case, I think most people ignore, and it's this very significant thing. That's generally people are going to be using your stuff. They're going to be copying things they see off the internet. And if they can't copy-paste efficiently and have it work, or effectively, I guess, not efficiently, they never get to the point of understanding.
Yeah, there's a very important aspect of what we do as developers that I think gets missed a lot of the time, which is that at the end of the day, everything we do is about people. It's about the end users, and when you're building an application, the end user is the end user. But when you're building a programming language or you're building a framework, the end user is another developer, and what counts as developer is not a uniform thing, right? It's a continuum. It's everything from the guy who's just copying and pasting stuff off the internet to the guy who is building, the New York Stock Exchange's high-frequency trading systems.
Yeah.
And those are not the same job at all.
Yeah. Right, well, we don't actually have any live questions, and I think that's because I failed to update the event after we rescheduled for this week. So we have 3 live viewers. Thank you all, live viewers, for watching.
Yay!
Apologize that there aren't any live questions for you, but we just want to thank you a lot for coming. It was a great discussion. Yeah, and looking forward to seeing what comes when Lift 3 is done. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Soon, any second now.
Yeah. Any second. What's the cat say? That's...
the cat is just about as asleep as cats get. Which means as soon as he realizes he can get attention again, he'll be 100% awake.
Actually, I think what it means is this interview went well. The Overlord approves. the Overlord is not worried.
That is an excellent spin. I like it.
Nice. Well, thanks, everyone.